Is there a spirit world, some supernatural realm we haven't yet proven exists? Perhaps this realm has sentient beings of some sort, the creator or God of our universe perhaps. Now there's been a lot of back and forth about the existence of God, but really we all know deep down that it's impossible to prove nor disprove the existence of any type of God. So I'm going to discuss the following argument instead, which is what would it look like if the supernatural exists and the supernatural rules wanted to prove not only to us that they exist, but to all of the inhabitants across the entire universe. Now, I'm well aware that there are many beliefs across the globe that claim to have anecdotes of evidence or writings about different types of experiences with the supernatural. And I'm aware that there haven't been any concrete, conclusive studies about these events taking place. So it's hard to engage these claims directly. So instead, I'm going to explore a few different types of communication. And for each, I'll discuss what we think is possible, simply because we need some bounds around what can actually be done in our universe. I'll then propose some potential ideas that might be permitted within these bounds. Finally, it's so important that you realize that while I delve into the details of various aspects of particle physics, cosmology, and philosophy, I need to stress that I'm not claiming that this is the way that a supernatural would communicate. I'm just exploring what can't completely be ruled out with our current understandings. It's also hopefully the beginning of a very important conversation around the relationship between metaphysics and our beliefs. So I encourage other YouTubers out there who see this video to reply to this video with their views, whatever those views may be. Okay, so we have to understand the space of possibilities. To do this, I have to draw upon natural philosophy, which is the exploration of how the natural world behaves. Today, this is what we call the study of physics. Now, the way we explore physics is through repeatable observations that we make about the universe. We then create possible explanations for the observation called hypotheses. These hypotheses must have predictions that we should be able to observe or test. If the predictions or consequences of a hypothesis have survived a significant level of scrutiny in many different ways by many different tests or experiments without significant problems, it then becomes a theory. So the word theory means that it is a tested hypothesis. It is a hypothesis that has undergone a significant level of scrutiny. And this scrutiny, it never really goes away. There are always skeptics that are trying their very best to poke holes in these theories. And sometimes that results in a totally new understanding that revolutionizes a field of study. Now, many of you would recognize this as the scientific method, but I intentionally left that terminology out of it. The word science has been a polarizing word, especially in the religious community. Many see it as science versus religion, something weaponized by atheists to undermine religious thought. That may be true in some instances, but I think the true essence of this method actually allows us to determine the nature of our relationship with the universe and discover the realm of possibilities. It's important to note that this method is not in the business of producing facts, nor is it in the business of undermining belief systems. Instead, it's about finding the most likely explanations or relationships for repeatable observations. It's thanks to this method that we've advanced in ways that we never could have imagined. Now, while we think we know a lot more today than we used to, it's always important to remember that there were times like this before, where we thought we knew almost everything. In fact, about 150 years ago, many well-respected physicists believed that our understanding of physics was almost entirely complete. Max Planck's professor told him, "Theoretical physics is noticeably approaching its completion to the same degree as geometry did centuries ago." A similar quote, more famous, was made a few decades later by Lord Kelvin. He famously declared that there is nothing new to be discovered in physics now. All that remains is more and more precise measurement. What they meant by this was that they believed physics was pretty much fully understood, and all that remained was finding ways to measure things like electric charge and radiation more and more precisely. Just a few years later, Max Planck would actually go on to revolutionize physics by discovering quantum physics. His peer, Albert Einstein, would also unveil his theory of general relativity about a decade later. These two fields poked holes in the earlier theories, and they revolutionized how we understand the world today. Through general relativity, we've been able to uncover so many interesting things about time and space and how they're influenced by mass and energy. We've tested general relativity with the planets and with the paths of light from the sun. We've also incorporated this in GPS, because without this, the stated GPS position would actually continuously drift from its true position. There are also many predictions made by general relativity that have been later observed, such as black holes and gravitational waves. And it's remarkable because the language of general relativity is mathematics, and it was mathematics that predicted the existence of objects that we never had even believed were possible. Now, it's not your usual arithmetic when I say mathematics. It's more of a language that we've constructed that describes logical relationships. So using mathematics, you can start off with some assumptions about the universe, the rules of the game, if you will. Using these rules, you'll then arrive at logical conclusions based off those assumptions that you made initially. Using Einstein's equations for general relativity, various developments led to questions about how galaxies move and how light behaves. The theory was good enough to motivate significant investment in space telescopes and probes to uncover deeper secrets about the universe. Eventually, we learned of a different kind of matter and a different kind of energy, so-called dark matter and dark energy, each a form of matter and energy that we can't directly observe or interact with, hence the word dark. Now, recent studies call dark energy into question. We're actually not entirely sure about dark energy, but dark matter is something that we have determined is real and has measurable effects. You would think that dark matter doesn't contribute as much as ordinary matter does in the universe, right? Well, this is where it gets interesting, because multiple studies over many years determined that the amount of dark matter is more than 5 times the mass of ordinary matter. And just a reminder, we can't directly observe dark matter. We only indirectly know of its existence through its interactions with gravitation and a few other things as well. So this is a very surprising result. So could it be that there is something else out there connected to dark matter or otherwise, which we can't directly observe, if at all? What if this is a whole other universe entirely, with its own planets and sentience even? Perhaps that could imply the existence of some sort of other realm, supernatural or otherwise. So going back to our original question, if sentience in a supernatural realm existed, what could they do to prove their existence to all of the inhabitants of this universe? And the key word here is prove. Well, one argument is that this entity might appear directly in front of you and say it exists, resulting in some kind of religious or spiritual encounter perhaps, where your senses are able to perceive these supernatural beings. Now, this raises the important question, and that is, how would supernatural beings possess the ability to interact with the ordinary universe? After all, the universe must be self-consistent, and I would have to assume, given all of the observations across history, that it behaves according to its own natural laws. Maybe they're communicating through the encoding of information in apparently random quantum processes, and maybe they are doing this somehow in the brain. Now, our current understanding of physics and biology is debating the possibility of if quantum processes actually play any role in brain function. Now, firstly, what is quantum, you ask? Well, about 100 years ago, there were various observations to do with particles below the molecular scale that could not be described with the physics of that time. Eventually, we realized that the mathematical descriptions that we have of waves could also be applied to describe these particle observations. Now, think waves as in water waves in the ocean, or the way a guitar string vibrates. These waves I'm talking about apply to the probability of a particle having some property like position. So if the peak of the wave is here, then it's most likely that you'll find the particle here. But it could also be here. It just has a lower chance. Now, you can calculate these probabilities based on the properties of the environment, again, which you describe with mathematics. The strange thing is that we don't believe it's possible to determine the exact position of these particles, even if you knew everything about its environment or state. Instead, we'll only know the probability distribution across space. Within this distribution, where the particle actually gets measured is completely and fundamentally random. And that applies to all particles below the molecular scale in the universe. Now, given this phenomena, could it be that a supernatural entity could influence the particle without violating the laws of physics? I mean, the particle fundamentally has this quality contained in it that doesn't appear to be explained or caused by any other natural process. So if the supernatural entity influenced the outcome, the natural world is still going to perceive it to be a random process, just as long as there's no correlation between the natural and the supernatural. Now, there's even more strangeness, which comes into play when you delve into the details of quantum mechanics. In empty space, where there is no air, there's no objects, just as empty as you could possibly get, particles just spontaneously appear out of nothingness. And then in a very short span of time, they annihilate each other back into nothingness randomly. It's a process underpinned by quantum physics. It's called a vacuum energy, and it has effects that are argued to be measurable. So perhaps then it may be possible for a supernatural being to influence how these particles appear and annihilate, influencing the environment in the process. Maybe they could influence the electrical signals from your senses to your brain, or maybe they could exploit some quantum process that already exists in your brain. Well, there are some problems with this. Firstly, quantum processes are inherently small because they're dealing with the atomic scale. So the amount of quantum processes that would be required to produce a noticeable influence to our biological processes, which are much larger than the subatomic scale, would be far too large. The statistical probability distributions would just not be obeyed. So for this reason, it's unlikely that a supernatural spiritual being could alter quantum processes to produce some kind of sensory input to our brain. There are also studies that debate whether quantum processes can actually survive in the brain. Some papers say that the conditions in the brain actually permit timescales that allow quantum processes to persist. But we're still not sure because other papers claim the exact opposite, that it's impossible. So it's still inconclusive. So perhaps we need to explore another avenue. I mean, regardless, how would you know it wasn't an hallucination, or if it was a regular occurrence that you weren't developing some sort of mental illness in some way? This experience that you've had isn't exactly something that you could claim as proof either, because, well, it was just you who experienced it. So, well, maybe if others saw it, I guess that would lend more weight to the experience, right? And maybe there was some extraordinary phenomena that accompanied this experience as well. But then just remember, the question we've asked is, how could a supernatural being prove that it exists? And I guess I'm making an assumption here that this supernatural being is in some way more powerful than any advanced civilization could ever be in our universe. And most texts that discuss supernaturals, they seem to suggest that this is the case anyway. So given this assumption, how could the supernatural ensure that whatever they choose to do can't be impersonated by a more advanced alien civilization? After all, if we visited a civilization that was even 150 years behind us, we could sufficiently convince them that we are divine. I mean, really think about how far we've come in that time. Wireless communication to almost anyone in the world in your pocket, and there are moving people and pictures on it. There are cars that we have that can move at 300 kilometers per hour, planes that can move at 3,000 kilometers per hour, 30 kilometers above the ground, remote controlled spacecraft that can travel to other planets, and AI. Like, what does that even mean to someone of that time? You'd have to explain computers and electronics, like, so I think you get the point. If they did something an alien civilization was able to do, it wouldn't really be proof, because it would later be revealed to be within the capability of the alien civilization once we encounter them in the far future. So therefore, it would have to be something that any alien civilization definitely could not replicate. Well, it could then be a message that is way too large for any future advanced civilization to ever replicate. Or maybe it's a message within us from our creator, written in terms of something integral about ourselves or life in general. DNA perhaps? Well, as far as we know on Earth, DNA is present in all life forms. It's nature's greatest storage mechanism, storing an estimated 455 billion gigabytes in a single gram. Some people claim that DNA contains the messages and qualities of God. Perhaps this is due to an assumption that life is the ultimate goal of the universe, and therefore a creator would mark their signature on DNA. Perhaps that might be features like chirality or the nucleic acid sequencing that encodes information in DNA. So far, nothing's been able to conclusively show the existence of any such messages that are beyond what's required for creating new cells. When I say conclusively, I mean repeatable across many samples. So perhaps more research needs to be done. Well, okay, let's explore the other point I raised, maybe about the message probably being something very large in outer space somewhere. The problem here that I need to address is that any large-scale structure in the universe needs to be consistent and explainable with the natural laws. I'm assuming that nothing can just spontaneously appear. It has to come about in a manner consistent with the laws of physics. Therefore, to create a large message in outer space, we have to consider how the universe began. Our current understanding of the observable universe suggests that it started with an incredibly tiny volume, about 100 billion times smaller than a proton, something I simply can't comprehend. Now, in this tiny volume, there were these quantum fluctuations which produced these higher and lower energy density areas. A fraction of a second later, the volume rapidly inflated by a factor of about 100 million billion. Now, it's after this point that we call the Big Bang, where the universe started to create a soup of particles and radiation, and continued to expand but at a slower rate to this initial inflation. The higher energy density regions caused by the earlier quantum fluctuations pulled together particles through gravitation, and the resulting pressure from the particles that were being pulled towards each other produced these vibrations and shock waves through the surrounding soup of matter. Around this time is when light was able to scatter off the shock waves, and it continued traveling until it reached another object, like our detectors in the present day. The frequency of this light is very uniform across the sky, except for these minuscule variations caused by these shock waves. This particular light is called the cosmic microwave background, or CMB for short. It's probably the only thing in our observable universe that anyone located anywhere within this observable universe can view and agree on, maybe not directly on its layout, but on the properties of this layout. Now, you may have heard that we're looking at the universe as it used to be in the past. And this is because the speed of light is just way too slow for the size of the universe. It can take billions of years for that light to reach us. So if we keep looking further and further out into space, we'll be looking earlier and earlier into the history of our universe, because it's taken light some time to reach us. If we try and peer as far as possible, we find the CMB. It's literally the earliest known thing that we can possibly see, essentially a snapshot of what the universe looked like at its earliest moments. In 2005, two researchers, Stephen Su and Andrew Zee from the University of Oregon and UC Santa Barbara respectively, released a paper titled Message in the Sky. In this paper, they wanted to explore the question of how a creator might communicate with the universe. They believed that if there was any kind of attempt, it would be via the minuscule variations in the CMB. They likened the CMB to a giant billboard in the sky, visible to all technically advanced civilization. But there are some obvious problems with this approach. I mean, consider this. You're looking out the window of a skyscraper, someplace north of the Empire State Building. Does One World Trade Center appear left or right of the Empire State Building? This illustrates the problem of cosmic variance. Our view of the CMB is dependent on where we are in the universe. Someone located in a distant galaxy will look up and observe its distribution differently. So in response to the Message in the Sky paper, Douglas Scott and James Zibin from the University of British Columbia openly mocked the possibility that this was even being explored. In their paper, The Real Message in the Sky, they wrote that a lengthy message on the CMB sky is fundamentally no less observer-specific than a communication hidden in this morning's tea leaves. That's kind of a rude way of saying that cosmic variance is a thing. They argued that because the CMB represented the initial form of the universe, it was just an amplified version of the much smaller area that pre-existed that initial inflation and the quantum fluctuations that had been imprinted on it. So despite the current sphere having a radius of many billions of light years across, the information that it could have encoded is only what could have been encoded on a much smaller sphere, around 300 bits of information to be precise. It's a very small number. It's the equivalent of a 15 by 20 pixel black and white image. Now, Michael Hipke appears to be one of the few, if not the only, academic that appear to stand up for Su and Zee. Hipke was from the Sonneberg Observatory in Germany. In 2020, he wrote a paper which challenged critics such as Scott and Zibin, and Hipke proposed that instead of using the CMB directly, we should be using the statistical properties, which should be the same for all observers in the universe. That is, cosmic variance shouldn't be a problem with this approach. He attempts to decipher some kind of bit stream from this approach and shows that in theory, on the order of 1,000 bits could be encoded in the CMB spectrum. He's unsuccessful in producing something that could be understood. Now, 1,000 bits or 1 kilobit is still not much, but it's an improvement of around 3.5 times what Scott and Zibin found. What Hipke did was he showed the scientific community that there is at least one way that the CMB could potentially have some sort of code from the creator of our universe. That is one that does not have the problem of cosmic variance, and one that allows a reasonable number of bits of information. So we've potentially arrived at a reasonable answer to what could be the carrier of supernatural information. But what would it contain? How would it be constructed to ensure that it could be decoded? Well, it definitely couldn't be in English. No, it definitely couldn't be in any earthly language for that matter. Because, well, firstly, this would indicate a preferential language, which would introduce all kinds of problems, assuming that this supernatural doesn't want us to start warring over this message. And secondly, language changes over time. Ever heard of Old English? Latin, perhaps? English might not even exist in 1,000 years. And what about the other advanced civilizations across the universe? I mean, what if these other civilizations don't possess the same vocal and nasal structures that allow for the eventual development of an earthly language within their civilizations? Or even the same anatomical structures that permit the written scripts for such languages? I mean, not even animals on Earth share the same modes of communication. So why should we assume that an alien civilization would communicate just like us? So assuming that there are in fact advanced extraterrestrials, their language structures will probably look very different to anything that we've seen on Earth. Perhaps then the solution is to use physical constants or mathematical structures to communicate, using prime numbers maybe to broadcast some pattern in a manner that allows for the interpretation of some kind of message. And this may be possible, like we've actually done this before, like not for supernatural beings, but in our attempts to communicate with advanced extraterrestrials. This is the Arecibo message. It is a message that we've sent to a distant star system in 1974, though it'll probably only be intercepted by extraterrestrials if they exist there in about 25,000 years. It strategically contains exactly 1,679 bits. 1679 is a semi-prime number, meaning it can only be factored into two prime numbers, 73 and 23, so that this is the only possible layout of rows and columns. It contains a numbering system in binary. The message then uses this numbering system to articulate the composition of our DNA, as well as our planetary position in the solar system and a few other things. It's able to articulate very complex ideas and introduce the concept of humanity to whoever intercepts the message, provided they are sufficiently advanced. And this potentially raises another problem, and that is that any civilization that encounters a cosmic message, supernatural or otherwise, is going to have to be sufficiently advanced enough to capture, decipher, and interpret the messages. So in conclusion, perhaps we just aren't advanced enough to decipher such a message. Maybe sometime in the future we might discover a message and prove the existence of the supernatural. But just as likely, we might not, and we'll be just as clueless about our existence as we ever have been, continuing to fight over our different beliefs about morality, the supernatural, and how we came to be. But until then, we should all unite, learn, and question as much as we can, exploring all possibilities and discussing all possible philosophical deductions, because it's through discourse across all of science, philosophy, and the humanities that will hopefully arrive at a better estimate for our place in the universe and perhaps beyond. You're watching Tree of Academe. Thank you.